Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the My Football Writer YouTube channel. And welcome back to the big question. Once again, has been revived, but for the first time, for the big question, you've just got me. You've got an individual. So today's big question. You've seen the title. It's probably the big question amongst every Norwich fan, not just for a video's sake. It's why are Norwich City struggling so much this season? Just what has been the cause? I think there's been so many, and obviously I'm sat here to discuss it with you, but it's just been a season of annoyance. Of course, we all knew it was going to be, transitional under Johannes Hoff Thorup, but I think because of the high expectations Norwich fans sort of are used to within the Championship, and given last season still ended up in the playoffs despite a relatively poor run of form come the end of the season, last campaign under David Wagner, that with arguably what some may call a slightly better team, or maybe on par when Norwich actually have all their players available with the team they had last season, that they just cannot seem to get it right in the majority of their games. Norwich are currently 10th in the Championship table. They've won 12, drawn 13 and lost 11, and they sit 6 points outside of the playoffs. But why? Why is it that this season Norwich have just been sort of the epitome of mediocrity? It's just they've been smack bang in the middle of the table for majority of the season, and based off the results and the statistics given there, just of how many games have been won, drawn and lost, they deserve to be there. Ultimately, they almost have nearly as many wins, draws and losses together. They nearly have the exact same number. In fact, for a while they did. They had, well, not for a while, but after 33 matches, it was 11 wins, draws, and defeats. So in the following games, they've won once and drawn 3 times. And 2 of those draws have come with last minute goals conceded. The one against Derby with a last minute penalty given away. And then against Blackburn, who had 10 men, and Norwich scored in the last minute of regular time. And they still couldn't end up coming away with all the points. And that really goes on to the first point as to why maybe Norwich have been struggling so much. They have dropped 56 points from winning positions. Yes, you heard me right. 56. I mean, that is absurd. That is, if Norwich, it's easy to say this with hindsight, but realistically, well, not realistically, that's the wrong word for it. Ultimately, if Norwich, every game they took the lead in this season, if they had held on and won the game, they would be top of the Championship. Ultimately, that is, in a way, perhaps it's clutching at straws a little bit, but that is maybe a bit of a testament as to when Norwich are winning and they can hold on to a lead, that they can be up there, and maybe they deserve to be up there with some of the football they play at times. They dismantled Plymouth at home. They have put 4 past Stoke, Luton, put 5 past Swansea, put 4 past Hull, Watford as well at home. Albeit, yes, they are all home games, and Norwich haven't been great away from home. But when you consider some of the results they've got this season and how they can just blow teams away at times, it really does make you wonder as to, if you're an outsider, well, even internally, if you're a Norwich fan, you just wonder, how can a team be at times so fantastic, yet also be quite average? It's a very interesting dynamic with that, having dropped so many points from winning positions. And it goes back really to the ideology that Johannes Hoff Thorup stated before the season even began. His whole ideology of football, being Norwich manager, was, right, I want a team who are always going to score the next goal, and I want a team that will always be in control of matches. We've not really seen that over the season. And I think maybe it's brought on, well, maybe I can't really say maybe, it has brought on the criticism of which has been given to Thorup and his backroom staff, and ultimately some people have already got their opinions as to whether they believe he is the right individual, and others have said the part of it being a transitional season is ultimately case in point as to why he should stay, and some people think he should not be in a job at all. There's a big sort of mix, and as to where people may think Thorup should be the Norwich manager next season or not. And I think it's, albeit the season is nearly over, I think it's still, personally for me, I think it's still early to be giving shouts that a manager should be sacked, because when you factor in some of the other accounts, yes, he has said he wants his team to always score the next goal. He wants his team to control matches, which, going back to it, they haven't. Sort of going back onto that tangent, really, Norwich haven't been the team Thorup wants them to be. They do seem to regress and become a bit fragile when they go a goal up, and they just don't seem to have that factor of just a killer instinct in front of goal, albeit they have the league's top goal scorer in Borja Sainz, but he's been figured out. I think that's another reason as to why Norwich maybe have started to struggle. Teams have began to really do their homework on them, and they know how to counteract them. You just look at the Oxford draw from last Friday night. Norwich could not break down Oxford whatsoever, despite scoring so early on. They got a goal within 5 minutes, and then they just regressed. They had no spark ultimately, and it cost them. They end up again dropping points from a winning position, and despite, no matter how hard they huff and puff, they cannot get all 3 points. And there's been so many instances of that when Norwich have looked as if they should really win a game and they should control it, but they can't. And maybe that goes into the next point as to why Norwich maybe have been struggling. It's because they've just had barely any players the entire season. The injury crisis, I think you can't even call it a crisis anymore. That's how bad it is. There's going to be another synonym out there that someone can think of that is escaping me at the minute. But ultimately, Norwich just have not had the depth. They've not had the individuals that can win them football matches. Josh Sargent, yes, he's been back for 2 months now, and he's been scoring goals for fun ever since he's returned. But the goals from Sainz, well, that's not necessarily an injury per se, but his goals, as I've just said, teams have figured out Sainz, so his goals have dried up. That Lewis Dobbin, Benjamin Cresceni are now out until the end of the season. That is killer, because Norwich, when you take away Cresceni, they don't really have another left back. Mahovo is out injured. They only really have either Callum Doyle or Jose Cordoba to play there, who are both naturally centre halves. And you then look at some of the midfield injuries Norwich have had. Marcelino Nunez has been out injured. Kenny McLean has been out injured and also suspended. Emiliano Marcondes has only just recovered from an injury. Anis Ben Slimane had a big injury. Jakob Sorensen has been injured majority of the season and is only really coming back into the first team picture over the last 2 or 3 weeks. And it's just been hell on earth for Johannes Hoff Thorup in that sense. And you feel then this sort of goes on, well, it's sort of with this still on the same point, with the amount of injuries Norwich have had, that really, you can tell how much it has affected Johannes Hoff Thorup's progression of his ideologies with this Norwich team, because he simply can't do it, because he pretty much has a different starting 11 every week, and he can't integrate all of the individual qualities that he wants from his players playing in their individual positions, and how he wants them to play in games, and how they can integrate with their teammates. And even you look at players who left over the January window. Ashley Barnes left, but he was out injured for long. Grant Hanley left, but also another player who just was out with injuries for a long period of time. And then you have the suspension issues as well. There's been Kenny McLean, there's been Angus Gunn, who is now out injured. George Long, even the second choice keeper, is out injured. And again, it just goes to that of Thorup he can't get the same 11 every week, and he's not really had his best 11 to play. And for any team that won't have their best 11 to play, you end up paying for it because you've not got the quality of individuals that you want to play. And if you haven't got your best players and you have to put in others who perhaps aren't the same quality, or maybe they don't possess certain aspects of their game that others do, then you're always going to be in trouble. And we've seen that with Norwich all season, because it's happened all season. They've only had, I think, an identical lineup 7 times this season. Do you know how absurd that is? That is truly mind-boggling that Norwich have played, 36 games, and only 7 of them they've had a starting 11 that is the same. It's truly mind-boggling, and it really emphasises the point that I'm sort of trying to put across here, of that Norwich simply had not had the opportunity for Thorup to really integrate his philosophy into his team, because he has to keep worrying each week about a different player coming in and then what role he wants them to do. And then even against different oppositions, you always have to play. You're never exactly going to play the exact same style of football from an opposition team. And, every team does their homework, and every team has different ways of playing under different managers. But still, Thorup has not had his chance to integrate what he wants with his team. And we're seeing it with results, really, because Norwich, as I mentioned earlier, are not getting the results that are expected of them. But you can put it down to they've just not had the players, and that halts the progression that a manager wants. And maybe that is ultimately why they're not getting the results, because the style of football that is wanted is arguably being learned still at this stage of the season, because there's players who have missed so much of it and they don't necessarily fully know what's expected of them, because they've not been around in training, and then they've not been put into game scenarios. You even look at Mate Jurasek, for example. He's played 2 or 3 games for Norwich, and now he's out injured. He was brought in the January window, so it was going to be hard for him as an individual just to then learn the new style of play, adapt to the new league. And within the first couple of games he can do that, he suffers an injury setback. And you even could put that down to the players who were brought in over the summer. They've not adapted to the Championship, and they're still learning about the physicality of the sort of lower league, well, not really lower leagues, but below the Premiership level of football, where teams are a bit more physical and they utilize a bit more Route One style rather than the intricate passing play and heavy pressing football that the modern game has become. And ultimately, I've said that a lot this video, but no, I think that's a really key point as to why Norwich have sort of been struggling so much, and they are where they are, because they've just not had the bodies, and their management staff have not had the chance to bring that in for their best team, and different players are being brought into the side and then having to learn it all. And then ultimately you have to chuck them into the deep end and go a bit like Lucien Mahovo, who, in all credit to him, has done really well in performances, but he hadn't played a game of first team football for Norwich before he came in for those few games. And he's probably not had too many training sessions with the first team prior, but he just gets chucked in, and that's ultimately it. And he was probably still learning what he had to do in his first couple of games, but he did it well. But not every player can do that. Not every player can be fantastic and just straight away understand exactly what's expected of them and do it well. So to put a really, really long story short on that point, basically, due to injuries, Thorup has not been able to integrate the style he wants, and he's having to pretty much teach it nearly every week because he's not got his best players available. But sort of really going on to the last few points, really, the last two. I'll try and get them done a bit quicker than the last one. But Norwich again for struggling. They are so easy. They really are an easy team to score against. I've not really personally known a Norwich team that's been good at defending. They do seem, from an outsider, that they really are quite fragile defensively, and they do seem to crumble a little bit when they go ahead. Again, we've already mentioned that Norwich have dropped 56 points from winning positions, but even the quality of goals they concede is really poor. It's really, really poor. You look at the goal against Blackburn, it's a deep cross and everyone just sort of watches the ball go by, and then Andreas Weimann ends up heading it in from close range. The goal against Oxford, it's a long throw. 2 or 3 players mark the player doing the flick on, which then leaves Mark Harris completely unmarked in the 6-yard box, and he just tucks it in at the near post. Norwich really do concede some sloppy goals. They do. Their defensive fragileness, or fragility rather, has really been emphasised this season. They just seem like a side who can't seem to sort of get tight defensively. They do leave quite a bit of gaps, and maybe again that's down to their back line is still relatively very young. You have Kellum Fisher in there. Well, you look at the last back four that they played, Jack Stacey's was playing out of position as a left back. Kellum Fisher still only really has a handful, well, not really a handful, but he's not got all too many championship first team appearances. Callum Doyle, albeit has played a lot of games at EFL level, he is still a young player and it can be prone to mistakes in there. And then you end up with Shane Duffy not even playing, who is meant to be one of the big leaders in this team and one of arguably Norwich's better players. But they do seem a bit mistake prone at the back, and it's just so poor in terms of quality of goals that they concede that they don't help themselves ultimately. Sometimes they're the architects of their own downfall, and we've seen that a lot of times this season. And ultimately, that may change with coaching and maybe new players that can come in, but that's something that really has been a standout in Norwich's season, that they just seem to regress massively in games, and defensively they're prone to quite a lot of mistakes that it can cost you matches. It can. But going on to really the last point as to why Norwich maybe have been struggling so much, this was sort of the case against Blackburn, really. The team just started to play as individuals rather than be a cohesive unit. Maybe, again, that goes back to how Thorup has not been able to integrate his philosophy of how he wants every player in his team to work, and how he can get everyone in there and then teach them exactly what is expected of them in different scenarios and how they can work together. But they just seem to switch off, and they're not really in it together. They all just seem to want to do their own thing, and that can always kill you off. If you're a team of 11 individuals rather than a team of 11 men who would run through brick walls for each other, you're always going to struggle. And when you then put yourself in that scenario, of course you're then going to struggle. You're not going to get the unit that you want as a manager, or even as a teammate. You're not going to have that overall togetherness, and then you can build relationships with one another, and you can understand how to work with each other in the system, and you can learn sort of the individual qualities of your teammates, so you know what they're going to do, and then how you can maybe shift your game around to that and work for your team. But they were, especially the Blackburn match, as I've just said, they were guilty of just switching off, and they weren't working for each other. They were just concerned about their own individual aspects, and maybe in that game they thought it was done. You 1-0 up in the 90th minute. What really have you got to worry about? And you maybe think that opposition players are mentally hit by that and that you have the upper edge. But as we all know, as the game happened, they ended up conceding late. Same against Derby County. They give away a really sloppy penalty from individual errors and not really just working together and trying to get each other through the last few minutes. They were just more concerned about maybe individually not wanting to make a mistake, or that they just think they can do their own thing because the game is done. But that's really sort of overall, to sum it all up, that's just some of the reasons as to why I think Norwich have been struggling. Defensively, they switch off and they concede some really poor goals and they make some poor mistakes. They've dropped so many points from winning positions, probably down to that factor, and that they just can't seem to control games as much as they should, despite the philosophy. But the reason for that is because they've not had their best team available, and it's always having to change because of the injuries. So that has made a major halt on why Norwich just can't seem to play the way they want to every single week. Their squad has got very little depth as well. That it does become quite paper thin when Norwich get all of those injuries, really. And ultimately their best players are starting to be figured out. And I think because it's been such a lot, it's always a long season in the Championship, it could just be that players are tired. And albeit not many, well, only really Shane Duffy and Jack Stacey I think they're the only two players who have featured in every game. Or it may just be Stacey now due to Duffy's his incident of being late to the team meeting against Oxford. But when you've been injured and you come back, of course, your match sharpness maybe isn't really there. Maybe your fitness levels drop. But there's so many different reasons. There really is so many different reasons as to why Norwich have struggled so much. But for me, the main reason for me, and I'd love to hear all your thoughts in the comments section about it, the main reason for me is just because all those injuries, and they're not able to then have pretty much the same team every week to teach the philosophy to. They've not got the same players available to then who can all learn about the way they are expected to play and then really master it and end up getting some great results. It really has. I think that's the main reason which has cost them. But there'll be people who will always argue differently. But that's the thing. If we all agreed, the world would be a very boring place. But ultimately, what do you think the main reason is as to why Norwich are struggling so much this season? What are your opinions on this season as a whole, really? And what do you think should be changed, maybe? Or do you think maybe nothing can be changed and it's just a case of down to maybe, is it injuries and not having the opportunities to have the same players learn what they are meant to be in order to make them a better team under a new manager? But there you have it. Let me know all your thoughts in the comments section. This has been the big question on the My Football Writer YouTube channel. It's goodbye for now, and I'll see you in the next video of ours.